Go ahead and turn there. Luke chapter 7, verse 36. Now, this is early on in Jesus' ministry, okay? And so as Luke's retelling the story of this Jesus and who he was and what he was about, this is early on in the story. So Jesus has, he's still growing in popularity at this point. People are loving him. He's doing these amazing miracles. He's raised people from the dead, which people didn't do. He's healed people from a distance. Go back and read in the chapters leading up to this. I mean, he healed a man without even being in the same place. Like, he just said the word and the man was healed. That is stuff that no one else could do. No other rabbi could do that. And Jesus did it. And his teaching was amazing. So people were loving Jesus. They were wanting to get more of him, but he was an up-and-coming rabbi. People didn't know necessarily who he was. And so in this day, it was customary to invite people over to your dinner for a meal and share a meal together to get to know them. In this case, more specifically, to get to know what Jesus was all about. Okay, and so that's what's going on in the text this morning that we're taking a look at. And we're just going to start, and this is the kind of how I want to preach this morning. I want to kind of walk you through the text, kind of make some observations and point some things out. And then toward the end, I want to give you 3 kind of principles that we can pull out of this story. If you've been attending Sunday nights, we've been talking about how to read the Bible, get more out of your personal time reading the Bible. And we talked about, in the context of parables specifically, one way, and I think one of the better ways of interpreting parables, there's stories, there's a lot in there, but to look for one key lesson, one key teaching, nugget of truth for each character. Okay? And so in our story today, there's going to be three characters or groups of characters, and we're going to have 3 lessons that we pull out of this story. Okay? So that's where we're going to start. In verse 36, it says, Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, and so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Now reclining at the table, that sounds awkward, right? That was quite literally what happened. In Jesus' day, whenever you would have someone over, they would do, in some fashion, I thought about doing it on this stage, but I wasn't sure how I could, gracefully recline right here in front of you. But they would lay down kind of like on one side and eat with one hand, and this meal could last for hours. Now, that part sounds good because I enjoy eating, and so I don't mind eating for hours. But the part that seems weird is I feel like as an American, I would have said to them, hey, if you sit up with both feet on the floor, that frees up both hands. And you can eat a lot more, a lot faster, and then you can move to the couch, and then you can have your discussion, and you can have your relaxing time of fellowship and your afternoon nap all in one. So that's what I would have done, but, in Jesus' day, that's not quite how it went, and so they would recline at the table. Now, as I mentioned, Jesus was an up-and-coming rabbi, and the people wanted to get to know him, and they wanted to know what his teaching was all about. And so this Pharisee, more than likely what happened is most of the Pharisees were very wealthy, and so he has his friends come over, and he has this big banquet type deal, this big meal, and he invites Jesus to come. More than likely his disciples came with him, and they're all there. They're sharing a meal together. Now he's reclining at the table. The important thing here is that what's behind what Simon the Pharisee, as we're going to later find out his name is, what does he really want to do in this? Early on, a chapter back in chapter 6 and early on in chapter 7, Jesus is doing these things and he's healing on the Sabbath. He's upsetting the religious leaders because he's breaking some of their rules, their traditions, and most people love him, but some of the religious leaders are like, wait a second, I don't like this guy. And they want to know more about him, so they invite him over. And what I'm thinking here is that Jesus was walking into a trap. The Pharisees often came to Jesus and they would ask him questions. They would set him up and try to get him trapped in his words so that they could accuse him, shut him down, and get him off the scene because he was threatening to their establishment. And so what I'm thinking is going on in the background here is that Jesus is walking into a trap, and the Pharisees that are gathered there are going to try to kind of trip him up and shut him down. All right? And I think that's further exemplified, if you will. Look at verse 29 and 30. In the same chapter, it says, all the people, so when Jesus is talking to the people about John the Baptist and how he was a good man and how he came and he proclaimed the truth, and he talks about how some people accepted him. All the people, even the tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, they acknowledged that God's way was right because they had been baptized by John. Verse 30, but the Pharisees and experts of the law rejected God's purpose for themselves because they had not been baptized by John. So it's in a sense, it's kind of foreshadowing. In the same way that they rejected John the Baptist preaching about the coming Messiah, the Pharisees and their scribes and their religious leaders, they were going to probably reject Jesus too. Speaking of how the Pharisees and all those guys were looking for a way to get rid of Jesus. And speaking of the way they wanted to reject Jesus and his teaching, let me tell you this story. It's kind of the way Luke is telling this. He's like, oh yeah, that reminds me of a good story. Did you hear about the time that Simon invited Jesus over for dinner and how that went? So let's read on a little further. Verse 37, when a woman who lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. Now Luke doesn't go into details, okay? He doesn't need to give the gory details of what kind of sinful life this woman lived. Okay, you could probably guess. Maybe it was an immoral life. Maybe she was a prostitute. We don't really know. It wasn't important to Luke's story. All that Luke really cared about is you had a woman that walked in, and she had a pretty bad past, and everybody knew it. Everybody in town knew it. She had that reputation. And not only that, what a contrast between Simon the Pharisee, who thinks he has everything together, and the sinful woman who doesn't have everything together. Now I want you to try to imagine, if you can, what it would be like to be in that place. Right? This woman comes in, and I mean, she is, I don't know if you've ever seen, the ugly cry. I mean, she's coming in, and she's got the ugly cry going, she's got the convulsions going, and she comes in, and she throws herself at the feet of Jesus. Now, I always in my mind tried to picture this. What would this look like if I was observing it? And I was thinking again, I would be sitting up at the table. How did she get her head, underneath the table and the chair to wet Jesus' feet with her hair? But if you remember, reclining at the table, right? The feet are away from the table, so she can come in, she can throw herself at his feet, she can begin washing the dirt and the grime and the grossness from his feet with their tears and with their hair. And maybe you've been in a situation where, Christians, we try to sometimes replicate the John chapter 13 thing where Jesus came and washed the disciples' feet as a sign of humility. And maybe you've been in one of those experiences before. I have, and it was really awkward. And I can only think this would be the way to make it even more awkward, is that not only would you go and wash somebody's feet, because that's a sign of humility, that is a humbling thing. That's what the lowest servant in the house would do. Wash somebody's feet. But not only that, this woman throws herself at the feet of Jesus and washes his feet, kisses his feet, dries them with her hair, washes with her tears. This is a humiliating move for her. And I would imagine it's pretty humiliating too for Simon, all right? Try to put yourself in his place. Like, you invite this up-and-coming business leader. Say you're a businessman in the community. You have this guy who's coming on the scene, and you're trying to invite him over, trying to impress him, kind of trying to find out what he's all about and everything. And then right in the middle of it, this scandalous woman comes busting in, and maybe she's a dancer over at Visions, and she comes busting into your little dinner party in your dining room, and she starts throwing herself all over this person and washing their feet, disrupting your dinner. It'd be a strange scene to see, wouldn't it? So here she is. She's pouring herself out. And when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. She's a sinner. You have Simon, he's still thinking in terms of law. He's still thinking, man, this unclean woman has come in. She's brought shame on my house by disrupting this nice meal that I've done for this man. Not only has she done that, she's going to make him unclean by coming in and touching him. She was still thinking in terms of the old law that whenever you came into contact with someone who was unclean, that you had to go through all these ceremonial rituals to get clean again so you could go back into the house of God and worship. This is the kind of thinking that he's got in his mind. This woman is unclean. She's a sinner. And the idea is that she's a sinner, I'm not. That's what's going on here. She's the sinner. Look how great I am. And Jesus, knowing what he was thinking, which that is awesome, right? I mean, maybe it was written all over his face, and he's just thinking to himself, what's going on? Maybe he's looking around like, what servant let this woman in, and you better get her out of here. She's ruining my dinner. Who knows what? But it was written all over his face, right? And he says, she's a sinner. Jesus answered him, knowing what he was thinking. He answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay. Neither of them. Now, maybe you're a genius and you know what 50 denarii is and 500 denarii. Basically, a denarii was the word they use, a unit of money for a day's wages. If you were a day laborer and you would come and you would work for a day and they would pay you at the end of the day, you would earn a denarii. So that's 50 days' wages and 500 days' wages are the two people in the story. Okay? Now, I tried to put it in kind of today's terms. So if you're working at minimum wage, 8 hours a day, 50 days' wages is about $3,000. No small amount of money, right? I mean, that's I don't know about you, $3,000. If I owed someone $3,000 and they said, hey, don't worry about it, I'm feeling pretty good about that, right? Now, the 500 denarii, 500 days' wages, that's more like $30,000. That's really big. That's a really big sum of money, right? $30,000. So that's what's going on, the 50 denarii and the 500 denarii. Either way, the point is they couldn't pay. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the means to meet their obligations that they owed. Now, for you today, you're like, well, that sounds like my life, right? No, it's different in the ancient world because whenever you didn't have the money to pay, so as the people are hearing this parable, what they're imagining is going to come next. This was a very common way of teaching. They're trying to finish the parable in their mind before Jesus says it. And so what they're expecting is the moneylender to throw them into prison. Because if you couldn't pay your debt and the moneylender came to you and said, hey, you owe me money, give me my money, and you didn't have it, then he'd say, oh, good, why don't you go to prison then until you can pay me? You're not earning much money in prison, which means you're kind of stuck, right? That's what they're expecting to happen in here. But the moneylender, Jesus, when he often tells his parables, he throws in a twist. Like they were expecting something, Jesus turns the tables on them and catches them off guard. And Jesus says, neither of them had the money to pay back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now, which one will love him more? Which one? And in Simon, this is an honor-shame battle going on in the background here. I mean, it was when you ask a question to somebody, it was a challenge, and if they couldn't answer it, then it brought shame on them. And so Jesus asks them the question, like, you think that you're shamed because of what this woman has come in here and this woman has done? No, it's about to get worse. I'm about to tell you why you should be ashamed. And so he asks them the question. He mumbles back under his breath, perhaps, the one who's forgiven more. And Jesus says, let me correct you here. Jesus said, you've judged correctly. Then he turned toward the woman, but he said to Simon, all right? Turned toward the woman, who's still at his feet, washing his feet, but he says to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house, and you did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not pour oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Now, all those things, those were customary things that you would do when somebody came over to your home. Those were just customs that you would do, very little things. You have customs when you go to your home too, right? At our house, one of the customs is when we walk into our house, we take our shoes off. I don't know why. I mean, it's not that we're trying to save the carpet. I don't know what the real thing is, but somehow in our minds, that's what we do. We walk in, we kick our shoes off. Okay? So if you come over to my house and you walk in as a guest into my house, if you don't take your shoes off, I don't have to say anything to you. My daughter will tell you. Like, you will walk in and she will look at you and she'll say, Mr. Joel, take your shoes off. And you're like, no, it's okay, I'm just staying for a minute. And she'll say, no, take your shoes off. I mean, like, she gets really into it. Like, and if I don't listen to her, I'm trying to have a conversation, with the person, with my guest that's coming over, and I'll just, kind of ignore that. And she'll say, Dad, take your shoes off. And see, she knows. That's our custom. When we walk into our house, you take your shoes off, and she knows that if you take your shoes off, you're going to stay for a while. So she said. So if she doesn't like you, she won't tell you to take your shoes off. All right? And so we don't have to tell you to leave. Like our daughter just told you, right? I'm just kidding. That's not really true. Okay. In the same way, you have customs when you walk into your house. In the same way, in the ancient world, there were customs. And so if you're out in the ancient Near East, okay, it's a desert. And so if you're walking through the streets, most of them weren't paved. And so if you're walking on a dusty street, your feet get dirty. And so when you walk into someone's house after you've been on a long journey, a long walk, you would just, man, I want to go wash my hands. I want to go wash my feet. And so it was customary when you would get there, if you were wealthy enough, you would have a servant when your guests came in, hey, go wash their feet. And they would have, if at the very least, they would have a basin of water at the door so that when you stepped into their house, you could wash your feet and you could get some relief, right? You've been walking through the streets, you've got dirt there, you've got animals that have done their business in the street, you've got all kinds of yuckiness on your feet, and you just don't want that in your house, and so you leave a basin of water at the door. And if you're wealthy enough, which we're pretty much sure that Simon was wealthy enough because he was a Pharisee and all the Pharisees were wealthy, so really the servant should have washed Jesus' feet and all of his companions when they walked in. But that didn't happen. And so Jesus says, you think you've got all this stuff together, Simon. You think that you're the one right with God in this place. And you're looking with judgment on this woman who has come in here and given me this huge display of affection. This humiliating, I go into humiliating lengths to honor me and to honor my presence. And you're looking on her with judgment. You should have known better. Every person that walks through the doors of this house, you would honor by having their feet washed. Maybe if you're wealthy enough, you would have oil to pour on their head so they could get some relief. That doesn't sound relieving to me, like pouring oil on my head, I guess, but maybe if you hadn't had a shower in days or something, maybe that would be good. But that doesn't sound good to me. But that was customary. You would greet them with a holy kiss at the door. And Jesus says, how much more should you have known better? And yet you didn't do even these least little bit of hospitality, these least little bitty things that everyone does to show love for me. But yet you look on this woman with judgment because she has showed such affection for me. She's right with me today. You're not. That's the picture that we have here. And it gets even more interesting, right? So Jesus tells this story. He retells what has happened here. And he says in verse 47, therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. For she loves much, but he who has been forgiven little loves little. Remember, he's talking to Simon. And then he turns to the woman, saying to her, your sins are forgiven. Your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, okay, that's why we know there are more people there. That's Simon's buddies that are there. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sin? Okay, now to you, maybe you've experienced the forgiveness of Jesus, and so you know what that's like. That's not shocking to you. But when you're sitting there in that moment and Jesus says, your sins are forgiven, he's claiming to be God. Who else forgives sins? No one but God can forgive sin. Don't lose the power of that moment. It doesn't matter what your past is. It doesn't matter where you've been. There's no sin that cannot be forgiven in God's sight if you come to him with humility and you pour yourself out before him. There's no sin that he will turn away. There's no amount of sin will turn away. If your sin debt in your life is like, wow, I'm a pretty good person. I mean, you feel maybe more like Simon. You're a pretty good person, and maybe you haven't sinned a whole lot, and you feel like, well, I only owe maybe $3,000 in my sin debt. That's still a lot of money. It's still, the point is you can't pay. There's nothing you could do to take care of the debt that you've earned. And so today I want to remind you of 3 lessons here in this passage. Lesson number 1 that we pick up and we learn from the Moneylender. From the Moneylender, we learn that God is a gracious forgiver. He's a gracious forgiver. He's a generous forgiver. He graciously offers forgiveness to all who would come to him. Maybe that's nothing new to you. Like I've heard that a million times, Eric. What else you got? Hang in there. Lesson number 2, the servants. The servants in the parable. Greater forgiveness results in greater love. Greater forgiveness results in greater love. The servant who only owed $3,000, believe me, when they say, hey, you don't have to pay, that feels really good. But if you owe $30,000, you owe $3 million, and someone says to you, hey, don't worry about it. are you going to love them more? You're going to maybe you're going to start kissing their feet and start weeping, right? I mean, if someone was to come to you and forgive you of that kind of debt, think of how that would feel, right? I'll tell you a story. When I was in college, we were bored. I was freshman year. We were bored, and so we decided this would be a great idea, a great time to go mudding because it had been raining for weeks. And so we're like, okay, we're going mudding. And so my friend, he had a Jeep, and my other friend had a Ford Explorer. And so we decided, hey, it's four-wheel drive. Anybody else got a four-wheel drive? Nope. Okay, we're going to drive yours. And so we volunteered Daniel to let us drive his Ford Explorer, but he was scared to drive it. He's the nicest guy in the world, but he just isn't real bold, okay? And so I just said, hey, Daniel, it's cool. You can sit shotgun. I'll drive. We got this. And so we take off, and my friend in the Jeep, he's leading the way. He finds us a field, and he's like, I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere. It's Arkadelphia, so, it's after 9 o'clock, and so it's completely dark. I mean, there's no lights. The town is shut down. And so we just find this field. And so we drive through the bushes, to get out there into this field. And then he's up there, cutting donuts and everything. I'm like, here we go. And I pull out there, and I mean, as soon as I part through the grass, I see, and it was a big mud hole, yes. But really, it was more like a field it was smooth as glass. Like, the dirt was smooth as glass. And I had that little whisper, you know what I'm talking about? You have that little whisper, and you're like, I probably shouldn't be here right now. And I didn't listen to that. And so I just kind of, stomped on the gas, and here we go, and we're having a good time, and we're having a good time. Whew. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see these headlights because there were no lights, and so I see these headlights, and there was a vehicle pulling up, and I'm like, what are the odds, right? I mean, what are the odds that in Arkadelphia both cops, would be working at the same time, and one of them will be driving down this particular road, and so he turned on his little pointy light and turned on his blue lights, and then got on his little horn thing, and was like, please stop the car, please stop the car, this is the police, and I'm like, this is a bad idea. Whose idea was this? My idea. Okay, bad idea. And so we're sitting there, and my friend Daniel is freaking out at this point. Okay, Daniel, nicest boy in the world, but he's not bold. He's like, my mom was going to kill me, man. My mom was going to kill me. I shouldn't be here, man. I told you guys we shouldn't be here. And we're all trying to calm Daniel down. Daniel, it's okay. Just hang in there. It's going to be all right, man. It's just a little bit of mud. No big deal. We'll get some rakes. We'll get this straightened out. No problem. And so the man walks, and I'm thinking, he wants us to drive out of this thing, and he says, stay where you are. And he comes out walking to us in the mud. I'm like, oh, this is not going to be good. And so he walks all the way up to us, and I mean, he is furious. He's like, I'm putting on my game face, I'm like, hey, officer, how are you this evening? And, he's like, well, I'd be doing better if I wasn't out here messing up my new boots. And I'm like, this is not good. This is not going anywhere good. I kind of blanked out. I mean, he started throwing around words like, I could have you thrown in jail for like felonies and misdemeanors and all this other words. And I thought, wow, this is really going downhill. Daniel is crying right now, in his seat. He is weeping, and he's like, I'm so sorry. This was not my idea. And I'm like, shh. And so he goes and he's like, I'm gonna go talk to these guys, and I'm going to go call the owner. I know who owns this property. I'm going to ask him what we're going to do. But I have half a mind to take you boys down to jail right now. Back in my mind, what I'm thinking is, my mom always told me that if I got thrown in jail, that I'd be there for a while. Like, there was no, I'm showing up in the middle of the night to bail you out. You'll be there for a while, and then if I feel like it, I'll come bail you out after you've had time to think about it. And I was thinking, I've seen TV. There's no good things happen in jail. And this is not going to be good. And so I think, okay, calm down, Daniel. We're good, And so he walks off. He goes over there, and it's like eternity. Like, it was the longest time waiting for him to come back, And we're just sitting there having time to think about it. And so then he comes back, and he says, well, the guy's going to let you go tonight. We're not taking you to jail, which is what I wanted to do for you, but he's going to let you go. I want you to meet with him, Monday morning, first thing. I'm like, all right, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And he didn't want to shake my hand. And so, okay, we're going. And so we took off. Okay, we get back, and that was the worst weekend of my life. You had all weekend to think about it. I mean, it's like going and pick your own Switch, and then you have to look at it for a week before your dad beats you with it. I mean, it's like horrible. And so we finally get there, and I'm like, boys, we're freshmen. You stink, but you've got some nice clothes. Get a shower, shave. We're doing marketing here. We're going to look great when we walk through those doors. And so we walk in there looking the best we've looked in weeks, and we walk in, and we're like, he walked into his office, hello, sir, like not really looking. And he says, I hear that you guys are out in my field. And you're out there tearing up my field. We just spent thousands of dollars prepping that field because that's real estate for sale, and it's commercial, and we just got that thing prepared and manicured, and you just tore it all up. Daniel's like, Daniel, shh, don't say a word, Daniel. I'll do the talking. And so we get in there, and I'm like, okay. He goes through this thing, and he's like, well, I could have you go out there and put the field back the way it was. I could have had you thrown in prison. Thought that might be kind of funny, have you guys thrown in jail. But no, I didn't do that. And I could have you just pay to restore it. I could have you go do it yourself. And there was this long silence. And we're like, here comes the hammer, you know. We're about to get kicked out of OBU, lose all our scholarships, our parents are going to kill us, we're going to live in the basement forever. Horrible. He comes back and says, you know, when I was your age, I was probably doing a whole lot worse. He's like, so I'm letting you guys go. Thank you, sir. You know, and like we're shaking hands and we're like, you know, jumping and like doing cartwheels on the way out. You know, we were so excited. I'll tell you something. That was big. That was one of the greatest moments aside from Jesus being forgiven by Jesus. That was one of the greatest moments in my life because I was thinking this could turn really bad really quick. And this man looked at us with graciousness and generosity. He forgave us. I love him. I'll tell you that. I love him lots. All right? Daniel really loves him because, you know, Daniel, bless his heart. Anyway, I got to tell you some stories about him sometime. But anyway, here's the thing. Greater forgiveness results in greater love. I mean, if you don't feel like you've ever done anything wrong, and maybe you just don't really understand what this whole Jesus thing is about and what the good news is because you think you're a pretty good person, here's the deal. If you owe Jesus $5, you can't pay. If you have royally messed your life up and you feel like there's no way God could even talk to you, you could even talk to God, guess what? You're wrong. You don't know my God. You don't know him. He delights in taking the broken and putting them back together even better than they were before. Now, that's no license to go and get a good testimony. You know, you don't go make bad choices and then let God fix them. You have made plenty, okay? I don't know each and every one of you at a deep level, but I know you've made plenty of mistakes that God can use and God can transform. And you don't go sin so that God can forgive you. You know, Paul talks about that. You don't do that. But if you've been forgiven much, and you've experienced that, you know what that is. The third lesson is the scandalous woman. The lesson is if you humbly seek forgiveness, you will be forgiven. There's no fine print on that. There's no asterisks, okay? There's no... If you come before God with humility and you confess your sin before him, he will never say to you, yeah, I got most of that, but that one, no, I can't forgive you of that. You might say that to yourself, but there is not one thing that you have done that could separate you from the love of Christ. The love of God covers all sin. You come to him with humility and ask forgiveness, you will receive forgiveness. So I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know if you identify yourself more with the Pharisee, that you have this attitude towards sinners. Look, we have this opportunity tomorrow with the Harvest Festival. I'm praying that there's some scandalous folks that show up. I am hoping and praying that we're going to have some kids come in here with like the goriest, scariest costumes, you know, that they're walking zombies or whatever, and I'm hoping that there's going to be, you know, people that come in who are broken, who need Jesus. People right here in this community who drive up down this hall, this whatever I'm talking about. Highway, that's the word. Drive up and down this highway every single day, past this church. Hey, look, free food, free candy, let's go. I'm hoping they walk in these doors, and I'm hoping that you are not like Simon. I'm hoping that I am not like Simon. And I look and say, do you know what kind of person this is, a sinner? I hope they walk in the doors of this church, they step on this property, and they sense something different, a sense of love, a sense of acceptance, a sense of forgiveness. And they come to know a God through you and through your actions, through me, through my action, that there's a God who takes delight in fixing the broken and putting them back together. So I don't know if you identify with her, if you identify with Simon, or if you identify with the woman, and you're like, you don't know me. God can't forgive me for the things I've done. I'll say again, you don't know my God. He delights and fixing the broken. If you humbly come before him and you ask for forgiveness, he will not turn you away. And so this morning, I want to invite you, if you're here and you have never accepted Jesus before, you have never started that relationship with God, maybe it's been a long time for you and you've walked away from him for a long time, I want to invite you back. This altar is here. If you want to come and pray as Joel comes in the band and comes to sing, if you need to come and deal with business with God, if he's moving in your heart, don't ignore that for one more moment. I want to invite you to come. If you need to pray, if you're more like Simon and you need to pray about the issues going on in your heart and the way you love others or don't love others and all of that, I want to invite you to come and pray. If you don't know what to pray and you want someone to pray with you, I'll be down here in the altar. Mr. J and Miss Angie, they come down as well, and you're welcome to pray with them. We want you, if you've never received Jesus, if you've never known the ultimate forgiveness, we want you to know that today. And we want to invite you to come and know that today. And if you're here and you've known that for a while, but you feel like since that time of confession, you've just kind of walked away and you have plenty of things that God needs to forgive you of, guess what? He still does. And it's time for you to come and receive forgiveness. Would you bow your heads together as we pray? Father, thank you for the message of your word, the message of this parable. We're so grateful for the forgiveness we find in you. Lord, I ask you to send your Spirit upon us, upon this church, upon each believer here. Those who do not yet believe, God, I pray your spirit of conviction would be upon their hearts and that you would draw them to yourself. Lord, fill us to overflowing so that this church would be a place filled with your love, in a place where broken people are welcomed and restored. Lord, do this for the glory of your own great name and your reputation here in this community. Amen. Y'all stand as we sing.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turned his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. And I will not boast in anything. No, there's no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: his wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain? Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an His wounds have paid my ransom.
Amen. Thank you.